All right, welcome back to the program. In case you're just joining us, it's still Moneyline with me, Nancy, and joining me right now virtually is Johnson Chukwu, who is the Group Managing Director at Cowry Asset Management. Mr. Chukwu, welcome to the program. A happy Friday to you.
Thank you, Chief Nancy, for having me.
Mr. Chukwu, you're also a chief. You are also a chief, but perhaps I'm the senior chief, you know. But welcome.
Yes, so yeah, high chief.
No, I'm not a high chief. Oh. All right, welcome to the program. Let's get started. You know, we had this discussion on inflation just, I think, a few days ago, either last week. And I needed us to continue on that conversation because inflation is really biting everyone in the country, whether you're a poor man or even the seemingly big man, as it were. But let me start by asking you today what inflation really means, because some people would think that inflation is when, oh, prices are just going up, prices are going up. When I go to get this pen today is 5 naira and I go tomorrow is 10 naira. Does it mean that prices are going up every day, or does it mean that the value, that's the value of the naira, is eroding? Or is a mixture of the both? I hope you understand what I'm saying. The value of the naira in terms of the naira cannot pay for so many things as it used to pay for before.
Okay, let's start by what is inflation. Inflation is a change in the average price of goods and services over a period of time, or increase in the average, because it increase in the average price of goods and services over a period of time. It could be measured in most instances year on year, which means you're comparing this time last year to the prices this year. You can also measure inflation month on month, which means you're comparing previous month and the current month prices. So when there are changes in the average price and those changes are incremental, they're increases in prices, you say there is inflation. When you mentioned, does it also mean that the value of your currency, your money, will no longer afford the same quantity of goods and services you used to afford? That's the implication of inflation, because if your income is constant and you have changes in the price of goods and services you consume, it then means that you can no longer afford the same quantity of goods and services that you used to afford using the same amount of money. Take, for instance, on a practical basis, assuming your income is 50,000 naira, and your rent is 20,000 naira per month, and your rent increases to 25,000 naira per month, just taking rent alone, it simply means that if you used to spend 30,000 naira on feeding your family, you can no longer afford to spend 30,000 naira to feed your family. But if you now take it at the average price of every commodity in the market, including rent, increase by 20%. So it then means that what you used to buy with your 50,000 naira, you will now need an average of 62,500 naira to buy them, assuming the price increased by 20%. So, and that is what happens. So you can't afford to buy the same quantity of goods and services that you use to consume or demand, because the value of your currency or the value of your income has declined as a result of changes in the price level.
Let's talk about food inflation a bit, because that's where many Nigerians have that idea that inflation is rising. Because when they go to the market, they buy something today for 5 naira, tomorrow they buy it for 7.50 and all of that. They'll be like, oh, okay, things are going up. So inflation registers in their brains like that. If we take a look at the food inflation, though we saw it dropping to about 22.28% from 22.72% in April, how do you think, or what outlook do you have for it, bearing in mind even yesterday's news, what happened yesterday, especially for rice, because rice is one of those products that suffers from food inflation. With the injection of 9 million metric tons of rice by the Rice Farmers Association and what the CBN is doing with Anchor Borers program. So can you just deep dive into those numbers and perhaps what they mean with that recent development?
Okay, I need to re-emphasize what I said at the last meeting we had on this issue of inflation. And I said, look, if you look at the consumption pattern of our average household in Nigeria, you realize that food items account for more than 60 to 70% of their consumption expenditure. which means that if there are changes in food prices, the severity of inflation becomes exacerbated to the average household in Nigeria, given the level of poverty in the country and the fact that we spend most of our income food. So, and if you look at the inflation figures, you are looking at inflation figure, food inflation of about 22.28%. That is if you compare the price of food in May 2020 to the price of food in May 2021. It simply means on an average basis, the price of food between May 2020 and May 2020 have increased by 22.28%. And that will actually, to bring it home, I always like bringing it into the specific figures. It then means that the food you used to buy for 10 naira, the basket of food items you used to buy for 10 naira, you will now need to buy them for 12 naira 28 kobo. And your income must have increased by that quantity or that magnitude for you to still buy that same quantity of goods, food items. Unlike core inflation that increased by 13.05%, 13.15%. But because the most thing that we spend our money on is food. So when you have a food inflation of 22.28%, you can imagine the extent to which it would have depressed the consumption of an average household in the country. Because most households are battling with trying to sustain their income level. Most households have lost their income. Either a member of the family has lost employment, or they have increased in the number of their households because they have more children. So they can no longer afford to eat the same quality of goods, food they were eating last year, because you have a food inflation that came out at a level of 22.28%. Then if you now talk of the issue of rice, which is a major cereal that Nigerians consume, you realize that what the Central Bank and the Rice Farmers Association of Nigeria did yesterday is a one-off. And for you to bring down the of rice, you need to have increased supply, not just a one-off sale of rice or distribution of rice. There has to be sustainability, because it's a consumable. And the consumable simply, you eat rice this morning, and then in the evening you eat rice again, and tomorrow you eat rice again. So there has to be a continuous supply. And I do not think the Rice Farmers Association have gotten to that capacity where they can consistently supply or intervene in the market as they did yesterday. So we need to increase the quantity of rice that we produce, not just rice, other staple food items, yam, cassava, potato, beans, basic food items that Nigerians consume. We need to increase their production to the extent that we can meet the demand and possibly surpass demand. It's only when we surpass demand that you see a reduction in food prices.
Mr. Chukwu, I want to ask, I know perhaps you may not answer the question, but attempt to. How much is a plate of food in Nigeria? And perhaps for those watching us, you can send us a message on Facebook, Moneyline with Nancy TV. I'm interested to know how much a plate of meal is, an average plate of meal. Or let me put it this way, can 100 naira still buy you food in Nigeria? I remember even when I was in Lagos, I don't know if it exists here in Abuja, but I know there are bukas in Abuja. You go to some parts of Lagos, even on the street, you see women selling. You're like, oh, please, I'm almost moved to speak it in Yoruba, you know. But it's like, okay, please, put rice 30 naira for me. Put beans 20 naira. Put yam, put meat 30 naira. How much have I calculated now? I think 80 naira. Then give me a sachet of pure water that goes for 5 naira. And I'm made to understand now that sachet of water is 20 naira. What used to go for 5 naira. So can 100 naira buy you a plate of food again in Nigeria, perhaps in Lagos where you reside?
No, Nancy, unfortunately, even the lowest income earner cannot afford a meal for 100 naira. You just mentioned the sachet of water is going for 20 naira. Now, 2 slices of bread will go for more than that. So if you have to buy a sachet of milk, 1 cube of sugar, and then 2 slices of bread, which will not feed you, or you want to buy a loaf of bread, you realize you can't get this meal, the most basic and the cheapest meal for 100 naira. But if you go to a booker, and then you should be planning to spend about 1,000 to 1,500 naira. And then the minimum you can get from a roadside booker will not be less than 750 naira to feed yourself. Then if you want to go to the places like big women like you go to, those upscale
Mr. Chukwu, I cook. I eat in my house. I cook. But I go out
Francis, don't deny
sometimes.
it. I know.
I go out sometimes,
So
yes.
you'll be talking of spending about between 5,000 and 8,000 naira for a plate of meal. And there's a middle income restaurant, and those are places having Nigerian dishes. Then if you want to make the mistake of going to a five-star hotel for a brunch, then you should be ready to spend an average of 17 to 18,000 naira per meal for an adult and 10,000 naira for children of your son's age.
Mm. So it's very saddening at this point, the rate of inflation in the country, because even apart from rice, or people go around, and there are people that live on these kind of businesses, not just to even make their families survive, but on a daily basis they eat out like that. So it's like they would budget like 200 naira daily for their food. If they buy like agege bread in the morning, 50 naira agege bread, they will tell the woman, okay, open that agege bread with knife, put beans in it, 20 naira and all of that. Those are seemingly now the good old days in Nigeria, and anyway, that takes me to inflation in states, or inflation, yes, inflation in states. Let's look at that vis-a-vis rural inflation. What do you think? Because many states in Nigeria are also suffering inflation.
Yeah, if you want to dwell on food inflation in Nigeria, you have states like Kogi State, states like Bauchi State, leading in the food inflation index in the month of May. And the question I asked myself, why are those states? Of course, a state like Kogi State also had the highest all-item inflation rate among the states. But the questions I have asked, what exactly is leading to this high inflation rate? Key thing, like I did mention, is that major consumption pattern is food, and even the states that have high food inflation also have high all-item inflation. And I think that could be explained by disruption in supply chain in those states. One, you have displacement of farmers. So farmers who used to be producers within the local states have been displaced and now need to buy food from other supply sources. And then you have bottlenecks in supply because the supply chains or the supply routes in the country have to some extent been disrupted by the security crisis we've been having across almost all the states of the country. So, and I think that's one of the major factors that's actually driving inflation. Food inflation that we saw at some point as high as 22.95% in the month of March, and then dropped to 22.72% in April, and down to 22.28% in May. We are partly attributed to supply chain disruptions, displacement of farmers from their farming zones or farming areas, and difficulty of taking goods from areas that have been ravaged by either Boko Haram or any of those other security threats. These are factors that are leading to high inflation rates in some of the states we have.
Mm. If we take a look at the headline inflation that has dropped to 17.93% as of May of 2021, do you think that trending downwards that we're seeing towards, are we now going towards the lower tens, or yes, towards the lower tens now, since it's 17.93% from about 18.12% in April? Is that a signal that inflation is trending down towards the lower tens from the high tens that we've seen in the past 1 year?
Yes, what I would say, we've seen a drop in inflation for 2 consecutive months. And you have to recognize that what happens is that you're measuring price levels as at current month with price levels at preceding period of the previous year. And what happens in inflation, if the base, what we call base effect, if the price levels were already elevated at the time you are comparing the two periods, then the rate of increase will gradually begin to moderate. As we move towards the periods where we had very high inflation, and if you catch your mind back, in May 2020, we had an inflation rate of 12.4%. So what happened was the price levels in May were the prices that were compared to the price levels in May 2021. And what you saw was an increase of 17.93%. So as we move towards the periods where we had very high inflation rates, then the current rates compared to the previous period of last year will continue to moderate. So I think we'll be seeing moderation, not because prices are no longer increasing, but because the point you are comparing, we are already too high. So the further increments we saw were not as steep as the previous period, because you are now comparing a very elevated inflation rate to a level that though increased but did not increase the same magnitude as it was the previous period. So that's what's going on. Because if you look at the month-on-month inflation, in the month of April, in the month of May, month-on-month inflation was 1.01% increase. Simply means that if you compare the average price levels in April 2021 with the average price levels in May 2021, there was a 1% increase. You did show the one of food inflation, which increased by 1.05%. So if you compare the average price level of food items in May to that of April this year, there was an increase of 1.05%. So as long as that month-on-month increase is still sustained, then the prices are still increasing. But when you compare them to the previous year inflation figures, you realize that the increase will be at a moderated level. So we're not seeing that prices are no longer increasing, but because you're already dealing with previously high inflation rates, so the increment is not as steep as it was.
Okay, do you think that that drop will be transitory? Let me borrow the U.S. buzzword now, because the inflation at almost 5%, the highest in 13 years in the U.S., and you see analysis and talks every day on inflation being transitory in the U.S., which means a drop, a temporary drop in prices, and we've seen the U.S. Fed use that. Do you think that perhaps this drop that we've seen in inflation will be a bit transitory, or do you think that it will also move perhaps in June, in July, that's the increase in prices? Or do you think that that drop, I hope you understand what I mean.
Yes, I do. I do. What I think is that the decreases or the decreases in the magnitude of inflation or the rate of inflation will continue unless there's a further disruption. And those disruptions could come in this format. One is the issue of price of petroleum products. We still have the price of refined fuel or PMS at a rate of 165 naira at the pump. And I remember just this week, the GMD of NNPC said, look, their landing cost is more than 250 naira, and that they are absorbing so much of subsidy, and that this is no longer sustainable. So should they adjust the price of petroleum products or fuel, you're going to see the trickle-down effect of that on all consumer heads or consumer items, and you could see increase in transport costs, increase in food items. So you could see a reversal of the current declining trend we have.
So, so what you're saying, sorry to butt you, so what you just said now, what came to my head is, if that happens, for example, you know, and we've also seen the rise in oil prices, that means it would affect the core inflation basket, as it were, the core index.
Absolutely. That's actually, it will affect all
items
all the
apart
13
from
consumer items that are measured by NBS. So, because it will affect the pump price, it will affect transport costs, it will affect cost of every other item, because all of them have some impact. The trickle-down effect of an increase in fuel will affect virtually all the consumption items. But that's one of the factors that could drive inflation further, that could reverse the current trend we are seeing. So the current trend will only be transitory if we have dislocations. And those dislocations can also include if the insecurity we have in the country worsens and more farmers are displaced. So farming activities further decline, so you see a further elevation in food prices. But in the absence of any of these distortions, I think we should expect that the current trend will be sustained, because we're now dealing with a higher base. Because if you look at the inflation figures, at some point, I remember as late as March, the inflation figure was as high as 18.75%, 18.7%. So if by the time we get to March next year, you will realize that the inflation figure would have reduced materially, because we are now comparing a very elevated price level to a much lower increment in subsequent year.
Mr. Chukwu, let's talk about the employment market, which we've seen tighten. and even made worse by COVID-19 pandemic, made worse with also this macroeconomic statistics that we have. What do you think would now be really the correlation with inflation, especially putting more pressure on the unemployed and even the employed alike?
Okay, in the first place, you remember that there's what they call misery index, which is high when you combine the effect of inflation and the effect of unemployment.
Unemployment.
And you measure the misery index of a country, because if you have to use the misery index in a common mass balance, simply means how miserable the population of that country is. And as it stands today, when you do not have income, as we saw, that the rate of unemployment as at the end of March this year was at 3.3%. Of that figure, more than 45% was youth unemployment. And it then means that 45% of the Nigerian youths are unemployed. They now need to live and depend on their parents or their guardians. What that means is that the parents or the guardians, their income level, as long as it has only increased, the family can no longer afford the same quantity of goods and services they were consuming, because one, there is person who should have been contributing to the income of the family is not contributing, but is still contributing in consuming from the little that the income the family has. So when you have high rate of unemployment, at the same time you have high inflation rate, the misery index of that country gets worsened. It simply means more people are getting into poverty level, the suffering situation increases, and the standard of living keep deteriorating. So that's exactly what inflation does in an environment where you have high unemployment rates.
Now, in line of still talking about how inflation is affecting our families in Nigeria, let's take a look at the Apex Bank, which is the central bank of Nigeria. It came up with different interventions. I think it was even the first that intervened at the heat of the pandemic, almost when we were almost locking down. The CBN intervened before we locked down, intervening with so much money in a bid to reduce the financial stress that families are facing. Do you also think that interventions that we saw accelerated inflation? That's the A part of the question. The B part of the question is that if you think also that the Central Bank of Nigeria will be happy, if that is the right word, that the markets or Nigerians understood its pro-growth policies and the whole stance that it had at the MPC, at least for the past 1 year, to promote growth.
Okay, let me start from, like I said, there are two parts to your question. The first part is, do I think central bank intervention, monetary policy intervention through diplomatic finance initiatives worsened or contributed to the high rate of inflation? I don't think so. And why do I say I don't think so? I don't think the problem we have is excess liquidity in the economy. The excess liquidity would have come about if you have so much liquidity in the economy, and then that liquidity pursuing same quantity of goods, and without an increase in productivity, then you will have inflation. But unfortunately, what we are dealing with are supply
Disruptions.
driven or supply bottlenecks that are driving up prices, or supply induced inflation. And let me explain to you what I mean by this. If, for instance, the quantity of yam, cassava, millet, beans, rice that was produced in a place like Taraba State or Zamfara State or Borno State or Adamawa State, or even my home state, Abia State, is no longer being produced because people have run away from their farms and are living in IDP. It then means that the quantity of food that will come to the market would decline. And because even if you keep the volume of currency in circulation at the same constant, at the same level, that currency will pursue the smaller quantity of goods, and they will price up the average price of those goods. And I think that's what's happening. The first supply bottleneck was created by COVID, because importers couldn't bring in their goods, producers in China couldn't produce, the lockdown, and then the small quantity that was being produced globally were difficult to be shipped at the onset of COVID-19. So you had situation where most goods couldn't get to their destination, or producer couldn't even produce enough goods to meet consumers' demand. So that created the first bottleneck that led to increase in inflation. The other one was endogenous to us, which is, I've mentioned repeatedly, security challenges that displaced farmers, and which is currently, led to the high food inflation and also contributed to the all item inflation. So it is not the disbursement by central bank that led to excess liquidity. We don't have liquidity suffix. We don't have excess liquidity in the economy. In fact, if you look at the interbank rates today or the past 1 week, you actually do not have that market is actually constrained because of liquidity. But back to the second part of your question, I think the central bank intervention has contributed in reducing, taking us out of recession. And if you look at the growth we saw in the first quarter, the second quarter of this year, where
First
GDP
quarter.
grew by 0.51%, you realize that one of the drivers of growth was the manufacturing sector. And if you remember, central bank came up with about $1 trillion intervention for the real sector, manufacturing sector, and where they provided funding to the manufacturing sector. Not only that, they reduced the interest rates on the intervention fund from 9% to 5%, and that reduction helped to boost manufacturing activities from a negative of 1.54%, which we recorded in the first quarter of this year, to a growth of 3.4%. And because manufacturing sector accounts for almost 9%, about 9% of the GDP, that also influenced the recovery we saw in the second quarter of this year. So I rather think the CBN intervention, in the absence of physical authority activities, contributed significantly to, instead of driving inflation, rather bringing us out of recession.
Okay. Still sticking with the central bank a bit, do you think that the white blood cells of the Central Bank of Nigeria can really fight inflation? Okay, let me break it down. The white blood cells in our body, we have red blood cells and white blood cells. White blood cells fight disease. Red blood cells capture oxygen. So the white blood cells of the CBN, do you think that it can continue to fight inflation? Because over the past 1 year, we've seen that hold stance at 11.5%. The B part of the question also, that these interventions that we're seeing, which is a physical band-aid, I learned that from Mohammed El Iran, who is the chief economic advisor of Alliance Group, when he spoke to me last year. He said, central banks around the world are printing money, everybody printing money to, alleviate the financial stress on their people. But how long do you think that fiscal band-aid can continue from the central bank? Or do you see it at a point? And when do you see them tapering down on it?
Okay, the first part of your question, whether the white blood cells from the central bank.
Mr. Chukwu, I know you are not a biology student, are you? People like us are science students. We can use words.
Up to class 5.
Oh, okay.
You know, when we finished secondary school, there was no SSS. It was class 1 to class 5.
Okay.
So we are not.
No, we did the SS1 to SS3.
People. Okay, back to what we're saying. I think the challenge we have is beyond monetary authorities. It has to be addressed at the physical space. And some of the structural bottlenecks that we have today in the economy cannot be addressed by monetary tools. In fact, as it stands today, the central bank is actually going beyond the roles of central bank and is intervening by providing some aspects of what should be the roles that should be played by the fiscal authorities. Let me be specific. The issue of insecurity, which I've said repeatedly in this program, cannot be addressed by the central bank. The central bank is not going to build an effective army. The central bank is not going to win the souls and hearts of Nigerians who are fighting the government in one form or the other. The central bank is not going to be the police of the country. So the internal security issues that are displacing farmers is at the realms of to be addressed by the fiscal authorities. Second issue, some of the infrastructural deficiencies we have today, absence of effective logistic infrastructure. The seaports, you get your goods into the seaport, you get trapped there for 8 weeks, you pay a demurrage on those goods, you pay interest on the transaction you have used on the funds you have used to finance those goods. By the time the goods come out of the seaports, you realize that your costs of import, the cost of the goods have actually increased astronomically, because when you factor in all these costs of delays, the demurrage, the additional interest you would have incurred, even the cost of transporting those goods from the seaport to your warehouse, which are now at very high cost. By the time you factor them in, you have to pass that on to the consumer, because without that, you can't continue in business. That increases your average cost of goods and services.
Okay.
That bottleneck cannot be resolved by the central bank. The other
Mr. Chukwu,
bottlenecks,
very quickly, because we have less than 5 minutes to round up. Yeah.
Okay. The other transportation infrastructure that are missing, the absence of stable power supply, where you have to have your generators power your factory through with diesel, are not what the central bank will solve. So the monetary authorities can try as much as they can, but clearly you need an active fiscal authority to begin to address the challenges we have in the economy, including the issue of inflation.
The question I asked
of
yes, the band-aid, the bandage that we are all wearing now, how long do you think that we can continue to wear it, and when do you think the CBN will take that bandage off?
Now, I think as inflation is moderating, central bank will now begin to unwind the unorthodox interventions in the economy. One, you hear the central bank going to announce at that time that the state government should start paying back the loans they granted to them, although those loans were for 10 years. But beyond that, if you recall, central bank only a couple of months back increased rates on treasury bills. At some point, it got as high as 9.75%. I know it's doing about 9.45% or thereabouts, but it moved from less than 2% for the 364-day instruments to 9.5%. So central bank is gradually unwinding some of the unorthodox expansionary monetary tools it implemented into the economy, so as to moderate the impact of COVID-19. And I know a couple of central banks are also looking at, as the economies are recovering and normalcy is returning, to begin to unwind so that you don't have liquidity suffix that will now drive inflation in the economy.
Okay. I think we'll leave it at that, Mr. Chukwu. We still have a lot more to catch up on. Let's see what June inflation will look like in July, and hopefully we'll talk again then. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Have a fantastic weekend.